Hello, this is Jeff Cook from Air Base Arizona of the Commemorative Air Force. We're talking today to Ron Byrne, who is a veteran of the Korean War as well as Vietnam. He is a recipient of 3 Silver Stars as well as many other medals and decorations for his service in the Air Force for 27 years. Most importantly, he spent 7.5 years as a prisoner of war of the North Vietnamese. Ron, thank you for talking to us today, and thank you for your service during many years.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'd like to start out, if we could, I noticed in your biography that you spent some time at the Merchant Marine Academy. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I was raised in Long Island, and at the base of Long Island is Kings Point, and Kings Point had the Merchant Marine Academy. When I left high school, my parents couldn't afford to send me to college. I took the entrance exam for the Merchant Marine Academy and was able to succeed. I spent just over 3 years. I left the academy with the intention of going to law school, St. John's Law School. Mm-hmm. But the Korean War and the draft was in the way because I was out of the academy and not in law school, St. John's Law School. And so I had to enlist in the Air Force with the intention of going to aviation cadets. I had an aviation that confirmed as an applicant for the aviation cadet program. Mm-hmm. Finished basic training out of San Antonio with the Air Force and then into pilot training. But the academy still keeps me in their sights. I'm listed in the class of 1950, and they gave me an honorary PhD degree, and one of the memoirs on my table here was given to me after I made a speech to them of my experiences. So.
Okay. And then after your training as a pilot, you went to Korea and flew 75 combat missions. Could you talk a little bit about that?
At the time, a whole bunch of people going through the pilot training program because of the Korean War, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the ones selected to go into the F-86, and went through the F-86 program at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas before going over to Vietnam, arriving there in the fall, late fall of 1952. And while a lot of activity was underway with the F-86s going into the far northwest part of Korea to inhibit the MiGs that were there attacking the bombers like our B-26, B-25, B-29s that were then employed in the Korean War. I was very, very fortunate in the respect to the squadron I was in, had people that were quite well known. My squadron commander, Colonel Rudell, was credited with 8 MiGs destroyed. One of the other people there, Mr. Hal Fisher, he got 10 MiGs destroyed before he, in fact, was shot down actually across the border from Korea into Manchuria. He was shot down in Manchuria and was held there for a period of time after the armistice. And of course, it was Joe McConnell who was the leading jet ace of the jet age, and to this day I believe is the leading jet age as far as American pilots are concerned. So I had, as a young green second lieutenant, I served with some outstanding people and got a lot of good experience before the armistice. So.
Could you give us a little bit of idea what you thought of the F-86 as an aircraft?
I always thought the F-86 should have been issued to every young airman because it was a beautiful beautiful airplane to fly. It's just a wonder. I enjoyed every minute flying it. I had the opportunity to fly it after getting back to the States after the Korean War, when I was in Indiana going at Grissom Air Force Base, assigned there after going through maintenance school later in my career.
Mm-hmm. Could you just kind of briefly sketch what happened, what your career progression was once you returned from Korea until you were on your way to Vietnam?
Okay. Because there was a flood of pilots coming back, of course, my career was cut short in Korea because of the armistice. I would have had another 25 missions, and I regret that for a couple of reasons, but most expressly because the norm at the time was your first 50 missions you were spent on somebody's wing. The next 25 missions you could be leading an element, meaning you could be on the site as a gunner against enemy airplane, and the last 25 you were a leader. You could lead missions up there. And so I never got to that point of that 25. But then the armistice occurred, and we had this flood of pilots coming home, and I had the misfortune in my mind of being sent to a training base, and not in a flying position, but in a position where I was administrative. I was going to be the adjutant of a maintenance squadron. In that maintenance squadron, I was able to, since maintenance on airplanes, after the planes completed their periodic maintenance, they had to be test flown, and so I could do that. So I got a lot of test flying at that period of time. But the flying was not that much and not that, shall we say, that interesting. So I thought I needed to get out of training command. So I applied for and was sent to maintenance officer school, which is up in Rantoul, Illinois, at Chanute Air Force Base. Completed that program, and the next assignment was into Tactical Air Command, but to Grissom Air Force Base, where they were just initiating some F-100 squadrons. But I was put into field maintenance then as quality control and test pilot, and so I was doing a lot of test flight. That's where I had the opportunity again to fly the F-86, because the pilots were checking out in the new F-100, were leaving the F-86. That was the airplane that they had, and the F-100 was replacing it. I was there for a period of time, and then since that all of those squadrons were going to be reassigned some other place, I also was declared for a new reassignment. It was to England Air Force Base in Alexandria, Louisiana, in a tactical air base with 2 fighter wings there, one of which was checking out in the F-100, and I was assigned to that squadron, and I checked out in the F-100 at that time as the maintenance officer and doing flying of all kinds and a lot of test flying. I participated with them on a rotation over to Aviano Air Base in Italy, and altogether a very good experience. But I was still not in the primary position of pilot. And so I decided at that time I needed to do something. I applied for, was accepted for advanced training in civilian education. I went through Oklahoma State University to get a degree in mechanical engineering, which the Air Force needed engineers at that time with the burgeoning missile systems that were going on. I got a degree then in the mechanical engineering and was sent to Ballistic Missile Division out in Los Angeles with the Titan I program, and stayed with that through a period of time, and then transitioned and worked on the Titan II program when when the missile systems were sent out to San Bernardino, California, to work in to work there at Norton Air Force Base. But my applications were kept current of wanting to go back to the cockpit, and after I was there in the missiles business for about 2.5 years, I was sent back to the cockpit, going up to Las Vegas again, where I had been there in the F-86. I was now going there to check out the F-105.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier that you went through a survival school at a particularly significant date in our history. Can you go over that?
Well, part of the training that any person would get into a fighter wing, he needs to go to survival school. He needs to be current in the latest thinking that the Air Force have on the ability to escape, evade, and if captured, how to perform. And so my assignment was at Stead Air Force Base outside of Reno, Nevada, and I went through the program there, and the program was a lot of education, but some field exercises. One of the exercises was going through what they hoped would be a typical POW experience. And so I was with a group of other people in a POW compound when they all of a sudden came in and stopped the exercise because, as they told us, the president had been assassinated. We, of course, thought this was a ploy. It was just part of the exercise to put us off balance in a way, but they actually sent us away from the place where all the exercises were being maintained and sent back to our quarters and to the television, and there on the television was the fact that Kennedy had been assassinated, and I had the opportunity to see the assassinator being killed by Jack Ruby on the tube at that point. That's when I knew for sure that indeed it was no ploy. It had happened.
Ron, I'd like it if you could please kind of transition us into your experiences in Vietnam, where you were stationed, and of course, the mission that you were shot down at.
Okay, as I said, that I was assigned out of transition training into the F-105 to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa and into the 67th Fighter Squadron as a flight commander, and flying their designed as a nuclear mission, but things were occurring in Southeast Asia, and we found ourselves flying out of Korat Air Base in Thailand. Now, inside Thailand, I was doing all the scheduling for the squadron, and for the squadron commander, Robbie Reisner, who had the unique experience of being featured on the cover of Time magazine with our squadron helmets depicted there. And that was going to do me no good when I eventually was captured, because I had that same helmet with me. And I had the problems with one of the pilots that we were had come down and was flying with us, and so as the person doing all the scheduling, I decided I would take over a position in his flight so I could determine whether or not this man was the right person we needed for flying with us in combat. So I adjusted the schedule then to include myself in the flight with him to observe his contact. Unfortunately, I was correct. He was not the kind of pilot that we needed, and when we were undergoing a special test of a flight in which we could toss bomb the airplane, our bombs into a target, which necessitated a defined point over which you had to fly on a defined heading into the target and then loft your weapons into that target. But we had 4 airplanes and only that one point and that one heading, and so all 4 airplanes had to fly that same route into that target, and I was the last one to hit that initial point. And as I was flying at 550 knots right on the deck, I was hit by rounds that I believe were aimed at him. And he was not going at the speed that we had briefed, but going at a slower speed. And so I was hit in rounds that were aimed at him, but because of his speed, he got out of the way, but because of my increased speed, I intercepted the rounds. I was able to get up to 15,000 feet, but I experienced white fire in the cockpit. Now, white fire had to have been from either magnesium in the structure of the airplane or more probably the incendiary rounds from the gun that in the compartment that I sustained the fire. But anyway, I got white fire, and I found out later that I got flash burns on my face. Luckily, I had the visor on over my eyes, and I had an oxygen mask over my nose and mouth. But my cheek, exposed to the fire, got seriously burned at that. But I was forced to bail out at that point. I could see as I was coming down that I was coming down to the top of a small hill, and I was like a sugar cube on the top of that hill, which had a small town at the base of it, and people all around that hill, starting up through the undergrowth and that bamboo forest to reach me. The first man didn't seem to want any part of me, and when I saw him and I said hi, he just turned around and left. He didn't want any part of me. But the rest of them were on to me in seconds. I was bound by my thumbs. And luckily, they left my boots on, but they took my flight suit and everything else away from me. Bound by my thumbs behind my back. I didn't realize how just tying your thumbs together could be so immobilizing, but it is extremely effective. I was on a route from that small village where I had been the subject of a political harangue by whoever was in charge of the village to the populace, and then taken out to a truck and then into a small army camp right on the river northwest of Hanoi, and then into Hanoi itself and into the Hanoi Hilton, our nomenclature for the prison camp, which was Hualo. Went through the main entrance and into a room there that was evidently reserved for those of us new coming in, room 24. It had a small area on the back, which was completely enclosed by 12 to 18-foot walls around there, but interrogated there for 3 days. I abided by the code of conduct, and especially troublesome was the ones in 3 and 4 and 5, which respectively says you will give no information whatsoever, and in 5 you will take responsibility if you are the senior man, and if you're not, you will obey the orders of those appointed over you. I didn't think I'd have any trouble with that, but later on in the experience, there were some problem among our community on that. But during that period of time of the interrogation, I had a major depression. I got to the point where I contemplated suicide by jumping off the steps at the back of that room 24, going into a small yard there that had a latrine at one end of it. But there was a culvert down there. It's about a 1 foot by 1 foot across and 1 foot down, very perpendicular edges to it, and I could see that if I dived right into that culvert, my head would hit that 90-degree edge of concrete, and I would undoubtedly be killed. And for a few moments there, I was contemplating that, and that, as I said, was in 7.5 years, that was the lowest, even through the tortures that I was going to experience later on. Other than that, I figured if I just stay alive, I will eventually be released. I heard whistling from an area that we called Heartbreak Hotel, an area of 8 different cells. And in a couple of days after that, I was in that area and in room number 4, where I found people from my squadron that had been shot down with them. And then a couple of weeks later, 2 more from my squadron, including my squadron commander, came in, and it didn't seem to make sense to me, because if they were trying to get information from us, we had the opportunity now, among all those from the same squadron, to make sure that we were all set on a story that we would tell any kind of interrogator, but it didn't seem to be necessary. In that bath area of that Heartbreak Hotel is where John McCain was brought through, and his story is fairly well known, but he was dumped in there after he was first picked out of the lake, which he came down in after bailing out. But he would have been left to die from his injuries if they hadn't determined that his father was a big name like that, where they took him out and they put him in the hospital of that. But anyway, while I was there, there was times when the stocks that were available in those cells could be used to completely immobilize you, and there's no way you could get to any kind of a mechanism to get those stocks open. That would be totally impossible. The squadron commander, while I was there in that area, he asked all of us, when do you think we would be released? And the questions were answered by the guys, like by this weekend, some of them, next week for sure, or maybe 2 weeks. And I said February, which was a good 2.5 months past any time, or almost 3 months from the time we were there. And my squadron commander has written down, says if I could have reached him, I would have choked him, because he didn't want to hear that information. That was something that was, and I was only off for 7 years on that. Our communications there had been brought out in by one of our, for the 5 of us from the 67 Squadron, Smitty Harris, brought in the tap code that we used. But we just started to think about it and think what maybe we'd need it, but I was moved to a camp on the outskirts of, it's like in the suburbs of Hanoi, which we call the zoo, and so named, as I understood it, by Ev Alvarez, the guy that was shot down in '68, as being the place where the animals came to view the people. So it must be the zoo. But I was in one of a number of the places, the buildings that they had in the zoo. And after a period of time, I exchanged area with a person out of a neighboring building. Turned out to be my squadron commander, Robbie Reisner. But when I got in there and started trying to use the tap code, the guy on the other side of the wall started tapping along the wall toward a portion of the wall. And when I got to that small place on the wall, I found out that there was a suspicious area there. I picked at it, and a plug pulled out of the wall, and there was a hole through the wall that had been drilled with a wire by Squadron Commander Robbie Reisner. And just so I could actually talk through that hole there. And the guy on the other side was a Navy pilot by the name of Wendell Rivers, or as we called him, Windy Rivers. And in our conversations like that, Pastor said, by the way, he says, do you smoke? And he said, oh, yes, I smoke. And said, well, it says, I really don't smoke, but I've been taking cigarettes just so that I would continue to receive them. And I have a cigarette or two that I have available. Would you like to have it? And, oh, yes, he would really like to have that. So I passed 17 cigarettes through that hole in the wall over to him on the other side. For a while there, I didn't hear a thing, nothing. And then all of a sudden, a puff of smoke came through that hole in the wall. He had received it. He was quite happy with that. As a matter of fact, we were planning on a discussion on my birthday, which would be the 19th of November. But on the 17th of November, they had me wrap up my things, and all of a sudden I move out of that building, which we call the garage, and into a room called the pigsty. And now I'm with a man from Okinawa, but in another squadron. He was Larry Guarino. Larry was the squadron operations officer for the 44th Squadron, and I had been there in the 67th, and we were together. And Larry had been shut down on June 14th, so this was August the 20th, or at this point it was in the middle of, on September 17th, so quite a period of time from June 14th to the 17th of August, of September, of September. And of course he had a lot of things, but one of the things he wanted to know from me is it a sin to think of your wife in a sexual manner? And I assured him that no, that's perfectly all. That's marriage. He seemed to be very happy, and the next morning he woke up with the biggest smile on his face. But anyway, during that period of time, we moved from that building over to one that had been under construction. We called the pool hall, into there, and there Larry and I were able to write letters to our wives and receive letters from our wives. And in that first letter I got from my wife, I got the thing that says, I knew something was wrong, so I went over to Gloria's. Now, Gloria was the wife of my squadron operations officer, the guy I was assistant to, and I waited there until they came to tell me. Says, by that time, I knew that you had been captured, but that you were okay. And it was sort of, I mean, that she could know that period of time. But in a later letter, she wrote to me that she knew I would have to come back to take care of our 4 sons. And indeed, 2 years after I returned at home, she died from cancer. So she just had premonitions of that. I think many women have that capability, or I don't know if it's a capability or detriment in some ways, but she had it. She knew she wasn't going to last. While I was there at that time, like that, I was taken out of my room, and I was taken into Hanoi. I didn't know what the heck was going on, but I was pushed into a room, and there in the room I was going to meet a self-formed delegation to Hanoi from the U.S. These are three guys that decided on their own that they're going to go over and talk with the Vietnamese and like that, and they were given options to talk to us, and I was the us that they were going to talk to. In that group was Herbert Aptheker, a historian and theoretician of the American Communist Party, one of the leaders of the American Communist Party. He's calm, analytical, he's dedicated, a serious man, like that. Also was Stoughton Lind, an assistant professor of history at Yale. And this guy seemed to be nervous, and he seemed to be embarrassed by being there and having me forced to be there. And the third member of that group was Tom Hayden, founder of Students for a Democratic Society, and a hateful, smart aleck guy. And of course, the husband for Jane Fonda, who we were going to hear about later. A few months later, on June the 29th of 1966, I heard an attack that was occurring fairly close. I could hear the bombs, and I knew our airplanes were close. And this is unusual because there was a 25-mile sort of safe zone with Hanoi in the center of it. And we had come in with our airplanes to hit a target, a POL, petroleum oils and lubricants, with warehousing site like that, to destroy their fuels and lubricants like that. And the Vietnamese got very excited, and they decided that they were going to take their beak out on us that were there, and they were going to charge American pilots as war criminals and try them and either jail them for extended decades of time or execution. And this was announced to the world at large, but also they decided that they were going to have a public demonstration. So on the morning of July the 6th of 66, we were raised relatively earlier than normal, and we were told to get ourselves in good tip-top shape. They came by our cells and took a set of the pajamas that we had as sort of a prison uniform. And later on that afternoon, they were delivered back to us, and the difference was that now they had printed numbers on the back of this so-called uniform. And about just at dusk, they came and got us, brought us out of our rooms like that. And the only time in my experience in North Vietnam, I had a guard kneeling at my feet with two gauze strips tying my sandals, the sandals that they formed out of tires and inner tubes, and they tied them onto my feet, and then put in the backs of trucks, handcuffed in pairs. I was handcuffed to Larry Gorino, and down down to town, and then we got to a location in the town. We were blindfolded the whole time, out of our trucks and into a line, and they now took off the blindfolds that we had, and here I'm on a side street going toward what appeared to be a major street, and I knew something was going to go on. We were paraded through the streets there for something like 2.5 miles, and finally got to what we determined was probably a soccer stadium, but it was a stadium, and it had a small doorway into the area, but the crowd was so much around there that the guards and the the soldiers that were there, they couldn't keep them away from us. They were on top of us, hitting us and like that. Larry and I were the fifth or sixth pair in the parade there, the march, and but finally was pulling first one of us was pulling the other, and finally at the last part I was pulling Larry by that handcuff through that door and into the stadium where we finally got away from the crowd, and waited there until everybody was there. Some of the last ones. I got hurt fairly seriously, but finally we were taken back to the place we had left, back to the zoo, handcuffed in pairs to trees that were around that center courtyard with a pool in it, as well, still blindfolded, and while the guards would come intermittently to punch, kick, or whatever, a lot of times aiming at the crotch, before we finally returned to our cells. I didn't know it at the time, but not all of us were being returned to the cell at that time. But the next day we found that guards were surly, and then on the next day after that, we got taps on the wall from behind us, where one of our friends, Pop Kern, who had been a POW of the Germans in World War II, and now was with us there, was tapping because he wished to talk to Larry, who was the senior ranking officer in that camp, and he wanted to turn himself in for treason because he had written a confession after he had been tortured. And this is the first time that Larry and I knew of actual torture. It had occurred with other POWs in other areas before this, but we didn't know about it. But Larry spent a good 45 minutes to an hour on the wall, tapping back and forth, trying to bring Pop back into a little bit of a sense of relief or whatever, that he had done the best he could under the circumstances and just continued to do what you can from this point on. That you are not guilty of treason, you're not guilty of anything but being a human being. But now things for us are going to really get bad. And in my original presentation to a local college here, this was the end of the first 2 hours of a discussion I had with them, and this now starts on the second discussion, because it began with that evening after we talked to Pop on the wall. Larry and I were, along with Pop Kern's cellmate, were taken in a small vehicle back to the Hanoi Hilton and put back in the Heartbreak Hotel, where we waited until the next evening. And then that next evening we were taken individually across the street from the Hanoi Hilton into a public building that had been emptied for this very special event, where we were then tortured in 3 separate rooms, strictly for propaganda. This the propaganda normal thing was a sign here where your arms were kept behind your back, tied above the elbows, and you were laid on your side, and the torturer would stand on the upper arm when you were on your side, drawing them together until he could just about get your elbows to touch behind your back. When you had that, the pain then was progressive. The pain just continued. The longer you were in that position, the more the pain you had. And if they were in a hurry, they would take those arms behind your back and lift them up over your head, forcing your head down between your knees on the thing. And so eventually all 3 of us had to relent. And what did we give? What they were looking for was admission to crimes and to thank the Vietnamese for their kind and humane treatment. After that, we were back to the HBH, and a short time after that, into a vehicle and back through the zoo and out to a outlying camp about 40 miles out that we termed the Prior Patch. It was a area that was about 9 different buildings, 6 small buildings and 3 longer buildings. The square buildings were all cells. Two of the bigger buildings was for cells and torture rooms, and the last bigger building was for quizzes, interrogations, and that sort of thing. There was no electricity, no lights, and so there was no bitch box, as we called them, the propaganda loudspeakers that were in all of our cells throughout the period of time we were there, trying to indoctrinate us on what they wanted us to hear. I with Larry were in building number 2 in a group of the 9 smaller buildings. Each of those buildings was divided into 4 two-man cells, and most of them had 2 men in them. Some of them only had single men. The noteworthy part of it was the interior of the cells had knobby walls, with like intermittent clumps of concrete put on there. So if you tapped on the wall, you would scrape your hand. You could get bleeding hands from that thing to it. This was to inhibit communication through the wall that we had in the other in the buildings of the zoo. It didn't stop us. We were still able to communicate anyway. They had like 2.5 by 5.5 foot plank platforms on the stanchions, so that it was rough wood, not all level or anything like that, but that's what our beds were. And they had extensions on the outside wall to keep us from being able to see anybody in any kind of a neighboring cell, no matter what was going on when people were taken out of things. So, and to meet all that, 2 weeks later, that outlying camp got the same word, evidently, that our zoo camp, because they started out sets of torture for the same kind of propaganda that we had already given. But that didn't make any difference that we had already been through it. Larry and I went through it again. Only this time they did something else in the torture. They took the ratcheting handcuffs, they put it around your forearms, between your wrist and your elbow, and then jammed the handcuffs together as hard as they could. I mean, really, really hard push to where the bones in your forearm could be just started being pushed together on that. So, and there again, the torture was progressive. The pain was just continuous. And so we had to repeat the same words that we had given them before. Conditions in the food there worsened and all like that, but like all bad things, the bitch box came in again because they got a auxiliary power unit to provide that information to us. So they would crank it up for a period of time, put out the propaganda, and then turn it off again. Eventually, we moved out of that camp and back to the zoo, and I was back in the initial building I've been in before, the barn, on that. And with Larry, we were there, and in the end room, all the way in the very end of that building, and he was now the senior man in this entire area, and there's no way to communicate. He's too far away from everybody else. So he had had rooms in the garage, the stable, the pigsty, pool hall, the library or office like that. All of these buildings like that had POWs in it, so a lot of them there, but no way to communicate. But the Vietnamese thought it was possible, and they recognized that Larry was a senior man, but during that period of time when we first got there, we were told by one of the interrogators, a guy we called Dum Dum because he was double dumb, he was a real character, that another POW would join us, but me, had to permit the camp regulations. Now, what do you mean by permit the camp regulations? So I said, I permit the camp regulations. And a guy by the name of Fred Cherry walked in. Now, Fred was also a F-105 pilot, but he didn't come from Okinawa, he came from Japan. He was up at a base in the lower main island of Japan, and they were at a different base in Thailand. They were coming from Tak Lee, and Fred had walked in. Fred, when he had to bail out, had the unfortunate thing happen to him that a whole bunch of maps and other papers that he had stacked on the top of his windscreen above his instrument panel, they all of a sudden, with the air, started were floating out of the airplane, and Fred inadvertently leaned up to try to catch them before they departed the airplane. Why he did that, he didn't know. It's just a reaction. And the airstream yanked his arm up and threw his left shoulder completely out of joint. When he got down, his shoulder was completely out of joint, and it remained that way for about 3 or 4 weeks before finally, and probably because he was black, and one of the first black guys that they had captured, they brought him in to put it back into shape. But of course, with one that had been out that long, they had to do it surgically. And they did that, and then the surgeons finished their thing and left it to the corpsmen to put him in a cast. And as they walked out, the corpsman took Fred's arms and yanked it up into position, showing him how angry he was with this American like that. And in the process, the thing almost came out, not quite. It was half in and half out, but they put him in the cask. And Fred said that about a week or so later, he heard a pop, and the shoulder went completely out of joint again. And when we saw him, it had been over a year that way, and he had an actual silver dollar-size hole in the front of his shoulder, where there was no skin across that hole. It was just like lymph fluid. There, you could see muscle tissue or whatever kind of tissue is underlying the thing, and he was that way on it. But he walked in. Fred was a good guy, and we liked having him. But even though we were at the end of communication, they kind of thought that we were part and parcel of the communications in the camp, so they moved us to an outbuilding, a small building on the very outer periphery of the camp. We called the hut on there, and we were in that building together, which had a view straight up the backside of the building we had left from, and a 45-degree angle out with one other area. And then on the other side of that was a wall. We didn't know what was happening, what, if anything, was on the other side of that wall. But it turned out that there was an annex to our camp on the other side of that wall that would become important later. But anyway, while we were there, we were receiving 3 cigarettes a day at 3 different times with a light at each delivery. And since Fred was the sole smoker, he took the light and kept the light so he was able to smoke 2 cigarettes at each light on that, and either Larry or myself was responsible for keeping the light in between. Or if we didn't keep the light going, because those cigarettes that they had in Vietnam, they were bad. And they would go out in short order like that. And so Fred would take the light, smoke his cigarette, and pass the light on to one of us to keep that second cigarette going. But the problem was that during that period of time in between, one of the times Larry would be the one to have the light. And Larry was a type A personality that couldn't keep his mouth shut. And he would talk, and he would have that cigarette in his fingers, and he'd start to go up to take a puff, and he'd think of something to say, and down would go the hand again, until he got that statement out of there, and it'd start up again, and then it'd happen again, and you'd see Fred's eyes just looking at the end of that cigarette as it's going up and down, and not into Larry's mouth to keep the thing going. It was comical. It was really comical. We spent weeks there, but they decided that we went through some quizzes on communication, denied it and all like that. But then we were told we hadn't complied and we had to be punished. And so what they did, the punish was going to be wrist irons and leg irons. Now the wrist irons are not handcuffs. They're actual strap steel cuffs that put it around your thing, so you have no movement in that. Except if you got heavy wrists, you absolutely no more. If you got light wrists, small wrists, and many times I dreamed of having the hands and the wrists of my youngest son, that I would have freedom in there and might even get my hands out of those things, and the leg irons too. Larry and I was putting in, the leg irons were tied down to the beds that we were on, and we were on there from late afternoon until the late morning of the next day. Fred, they tried to put him in the things, but because of that shoulder, they couldn't get his arm back to where they could actually put his hands, his wrist in those things. So they took him out of the thing. We didn't see him there for a while. So parts unknown. The punishment was lasted for 5 months for me, 8 months for Larry, like that. So it's not very nice. But after we were in them for a while, we saw what we purported to be a health professional, a medic or a doctor. He made it known to us, or known to me, where they went through it individually, known to me that I was close to death, and that I really should tell the interrogators everything they wanted to know, the quizzers, everything they wanted. I returned to the hut and placed in irons, but I had time to tell Larry, CFT, cleared for torture. And indeed, Larry and I were both taken the next morning through the rope trick again. I went through it twice, Larry 4 times, but what they would do is put you in it for a while, and then they take you out and ask you the questions like that, and denied again. But we beat it. This time, we didn't give in. And I suspect that because the interrogator in the camp didn't have the authorization to go the whole way. So, but anyway, we returned to the hut long enough to share with Larry what had happened. And then I was moved into the barn solo in a room at the very other end of the barn on that. and leaving Larry in that hut. And I was in that hut for a number of months, but in the wrist irons for 24 hours at a time, let out only for meals. You had to figure a way to get a slop bucket over close to that thing so you could use it if you needed it on it. But your legs were in the leg irons. Your wrists were in irons behind your back. This time they were in handcuffs with a chain in between them, so it wasn't quite as bad as the wrist irons. But the leg irons were tied to the extreme ends of the thing, so you were spread eagled on that board. The word had come in that somebody in the building had broken and revealed all of the communication links. It didn't make a difference. They knew about it anyway. Remained in the irons for approximately 2 months when Fred Cherry all of a sudden walked in, and the irons were stopped. And so it was just Fred and me in that room. But I noticed Fred was coughing seriously, and I had him cough and spit into a white porcelain bowl that we had, and I saw there was blood there, so he was coughing up blood. When I saw that blood, the only thing I could do was to yell for a guard, which I did, but I had the blood in that bowl. I showed it to him. It got the attention that I wanted, but all of a sudden, Fred was getting an increased diet of sweet milk. I got to taste it for a bit, but I wouldn't take anything. So they gave him condensed sweet milk for about a week, and all of a sudden he was taken out of the room, and I didn't see him until we were released. But during that time I found out what had happened. They took him to a hospital, and they cut him from the breastbone to the backbone around the area where that shoulder was injured the way it had been. And evidently bone fragments had gone from that area into his lungs, and that was the cause of it. But he had, when he was released, he had that glorious scar that went completely around, and also the upper bone on his left arm and the extended bone of the collarbone had all just deteriorated to the point there was no connection there at all. And so all he had was holding that arm on the thing was muscles holding the arm, and no actual bone connection at all. And that's the way he came home when he finally came. But anyway, after about a month, after Larry had left, I went back to the hut with Larry, and since Larry was still in leg irons at that point, I went back into leg irons as well. We were that way again with the leg irons for about a month. During that period of time, an interesting thing happened. Like any kind of organization, strange things can happen. They decided that they had a whole bunch of bananas so they passed some out, a banana to each POW in the camp. And Larry and I are sitting there in our irons with our legs spread-eagled when the door pops open and a guy with bananas is there, and he throws a banana in between our legs on each of us, and all of a sudden Larry is laughing like a fool. I'm saying, what the heck is going on? And all he can do is indicate at my banana, and I look, and the banana on mine had gone partially up one of my shorts on the thing and was exposed. But it looked suggestive, but it was funny. It was funny. We got our humor wherever we could on that. But eventually, the thing with all of a sudden stopped and moved us back to the pool hall. And into in the pool hall, we were in what you would call Communication Central, because that building had communication with almost every other building in the doggone camp. And so being in the totally out of contact entirely, Larry, as a senior ranking officer, was put in a building that put him in total contact with everyone. And he started to, and that's when we found out about the Cuban program. It's something that people weren't that much aware of. But from its inception, and this is a quote from the Department of Defense History, which is titled Honor Bound. From its inception in the summer of 1965, the zoo had a reputation as a bad treatment camp, on a par with the Briar Patch and the nastier aspects of Palau, with which, owing to its nearness to the city, it frequently shared personnel and programs. What was unreported was the direct and instrumental role Castro and his government played in the torture and murder of American POWs in Vietnam during the war. One of the primary objectives, they believe, was to determine how much physical and psychological agony a human being could withstand. What they did is they assigned a part of one of our buildings, the stable in this case, to a group of Cubans that came over, and they were given the opportunity to work with them as their tools, as their project, and they put a bunch of guys through a torturous thing. One of the lead guys, the guy we call Fidel, is a major torturer, installed his own personal reign of terror, which he described in documents based on POW briefs as a professional who was trained in psychology and prison control in Russia or in Europe. But they went through those guys to where they were really, really in bad shape on it. And another, I guess we expected maybe the Russians or the Chinese, but all of a sudden have the Cubans in with us. That was a little bit of a surprise to us. We heard during that period of time there that 3 POWs had been released in early 1968 and more in the middle of 68. And we found out that they had come from a special camp called the Plantation, where a highly qualified interrogator and indoctrinator tried to turn specifically selected POWs to accept, release, and give value in propaganda to the North Vietnamese. Noteworthy failures in that camp was John McCain, Stratton, who was the guy that most people remember as being the automaton who had walked into an interview with people and acted like a zombie, bowing to walls, bowing to anything like that. There were failures, but there were eventually 11 POWs that accepted an early release under less than honorable conditions. Of course, it hurt our morale when we found out about it, but it's the way it was. The rest of '68 and into May was relatively benign. It was quiet there. Things were going on that we could anticipate and deal with. But there has always been the thought of escapes. Other potential escapees had weighed the chances. Escape committees coordinated with their senior ranking officer, and while not approved, were not prohibited because of that Article number 5. I will escape if I have the opportunity in the Code of Conduct. It's when you start to realize that you're escaping into a local area where the average is 5'2", black hair, Asian complexion, Oriental eyes, versus people that were averaging 5'8" to 6'2", varied hair color, light-skinned, even more so since we were not out in the sun at any time, and Occidental eyes on that thing. And what are you escaping into? To the west of Hanoi, you go through mountainous jungles, extremely harsh for the undernourished. If you go to the east of the sea, it's flat, no cover. Camps in the middle of an extensively dense population there in and around Hanoi that was heavily indoctrinated, and they were promised $1,500 for Americans caught, more than several years of any kind of expected income for a Vietnamese peasant. So escapes from the camp, possible, quite possible, but then what? Gallant but foolhardy. So let's talk about the party. On a Saturday night, in our area there was a light rain. There was a power failure at the time. On Sunday, which happened to be Mother's Day, there was an early wake-up. Guards in our area extremely excited. Vehicles arrived, and screams were being heard. A part of the camp, a part that Larry and I had no knowledge of at all until a couple of months before this, they called the Annex, which was next to our thing. They had some 8 buildings there with 2 large rooms in each building that had anywhere from 6 to 9 POWs in each of those rooms. In one of the rooms, a POW decided that he needed to escape. He went into the ceiling of that room on the shoulders of guys in his room so he could get together with the senior ranking officer of that entire area, which happened to be in the room next to him in the same building with him, and said that he wanted to escape. The senior ranking officer could not prohibit it, but he tried to keep the guy from thinking about it. Says I've got to say it's not a good idea like that. But the guy decided that he was not prohibited to do it, and he had a guy to go with him. So he and this other guy got out of their building, went across the wall of their camp and into Hanoi, got to the river that went through Hanoi, and were gone for maybe 10 hours before they were picked up and back to the camp. And the screams we heard were from them. History is escape and repatriation, early days. In North Vietnam, no escapes, but there were 12 releases. I said earlier that 11 guys accepted early release for propaganda. One POW, the POWs in charge in that camp that he was in, ordered him to accept early release. That guy was a young seaman who was on a ship out in the Gulf of Tonkin, and in a rough sea, he actually fell off his ship into the Gulf and was picked up by a Vietnamese sailboat. He showed every indication to the Vietnamese that he was a real dumb, low-educated, low-intellect individual completely. He memorized over 350 names of POWs were there, some of which, a number of names had never been known by our authorities as actual prisoners of war at the time, and other information. So he brought that out with his release and providing all that information that we wanted to get going. In South Vietnam, they had a number of actual escapes that were successful, and they had early releases that were not predicated on the giving of propaganda, but were predicated on good PR on it. Same Laos with 2 escapes and 16 early releases. Cambodia had no escapes, but did have some early releases. And out of China, they had some early releases and escapes. Probably not known but too many, but there were Vietnam War POWs that were kept in China at the time. POW deaths, 73 of the guys that were known prisoners of war that were in contact with the rest of the POWs never came back and eventually were released in body bags. Of those 73 deaths, 28 we know died in torture. Probably some of the others too. In the homecoming when we released of 566. And that's of the military. There were some civilian POWs and civilian releases also. Noteworthy was in my area here down in Yarnell was Walt Eckes, the corporal in the Marine Corps. He was a POW for a period of time and successfully escaped. And earlier in the period of time, in our area, 2 guys, McKnight and Coker, actually escaped, were picked up within about a day. But since they had been kept in an area where there were no other POWs, there could have been no collusion with other POWs to help their escape. So they were, if you will, punished individually as opposed to having effect on the rest of the POW population. The 2 guys that just went out in the so-called party, Dermisi and Atterbury, that was an abject failure. Atterbury died in torture as a result of that escape attempt. Dermisi was eventually released on that. It's hard to talk about the attitude of Dermisi in this respect, but anyway. The aftermath. To begin with, enhanced observation by all the guards like that, which uncovered many areas and acts of communication, but they were not punished. And indeed, some thought there might be a tapering down of torture. But actually, what it meant was that they were involved with too many people to touch each individual case, because they were going from the original seat of the escape through all the different buildings and going through one person after the other, torturing them to ascertain exactly what had happened and how it happened. Within 3 days, we had established communication across the wall between our camp and this annex camp. But within 3 days, that was cut off. We had no contact. And the room which had contact was entered into a severe torture regime. As I said, Atterbury died in the actual torture. About 2 weeks after it started, Larry was taken out for a period of time, forced to record a tape to be used on the bitch box locally. Usually they have you read something for the moment over their propaganda thing. But during that period of time, the interrogator with the so-called Rabbit was one of the, I would say, more intelligent and more ruthless of the interrogators. Told him, don't rush it. Says, I'll be seeing you in a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, we could hear the whipping and screaming going on in cycles. It'd start heavy and hard, and sort of taper off, and then more people would get into the thing until, as it went down to whimper, but then it continued as each group took its turn. Starvation rations, but even with that, we had no appetite. Little food, higher stress makes for massive weight loss. The days we spent enduring harassment and ever escalating stress, the only thing being that after the evening gong went out, you could go to bed and you were under your mosquito net. And that meant everything was done for that day. And you just had to wait until the gong and the next morning where you had to fold up that net and wait. So we had that period of what we expected and had for years now had ability to relax. So we were under that net, nice and quiet. And all of a sudden, I have my source of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In my case, we'd been under those nets for about an hour when all of a sudden I heard keys rattle in our door lock. And I would swear I had an attack, a panic attack probably, heart attack possibly, but I had an attack. They came in, took Larry out, and he was gone. And now I was alone, spending 44 months together. I wouldn't see Larry until after everything was over and just before release. Next day I was taken to a quiz room in the Zurich, and I was sat on the floor against the wall while the interrogator was working on papers and occasionally just glared at him. I probably looked as bad as I felt. After 3 to 4 hours, I was back to my cell. I was forced to kneel on the floor in the center of the room with my arms extended over my head. And I was being softened for what would probably be next. And I was that way for about a month. Meanwhile, I heard what happened to Larry. He had been taken to a backside room of the auditorium, put in leg irons, not allowed to sleep. In irons all the next day, no food, some water. Same at night, no sleep. On the 14th of June, which happened to be the anniversary of his capture, he was taken out in leg irons, had to walk with the leg irons on his ankles, to the torture room. Kneel in irons with arms over the head while he listened to whipping and screaming in rooms close by. After 3 hours, the goon scout arrived for him, and he was pushed down on the floor, and his pajamas were pulled down and up, and he was then started to beat with what would be like a fan belt. What actually was a strip of rubber that was carved from an automobile tire, and they just beat the living out of him. Given a minimal amount of food, and he would not be permitted to die. He must feel punishment. As it continued, beatings, no sleep, harassment. He tried to admit all the communication and his policies, whipped to unconscious, then repeat and repeat. It's important to note that the Vietnamese camp commander at that camp had been relieved of duty because of dereliction of his duty, the escape. And all the other officers in there were under threat also of dereliction of their duty. Greenough's policies, because of the torture on other people, the information we passed out like that, were read back to him one after the other. He tried to commit suicide by breaking a window and using a long piece of glass to cut his wrist. It was not successful. The quizzer that they got him says, "We'll allow you to die, but not fast, slow." He was putting ropes, the rope trick again that they had been in before, and the whipping, leg irons, and torture just continued into July, early August. He boarded on the edge of the insanity. He was the ultimate one in that camp, the complex, that they were going to get with. He confirmed the existence of all sorts of committees, the historical committee, athletics, communication, carbine committee, investment, reunion committees, charitable committees, you name it. He tried to figure out a committee for it. Didn't do any good. His buttocks had been flayed, dried blood adhering to his clothing, his knees swollen and infected. He was forced at one point to kneel on those knees, and the pus-filled balloons on his knees ruptured, and the mess sickened the quizzers that happened to be in the room with him, who ran out. And in 10 August, finally, they removed at least one leg from his thing. While I'm still in my room with my kneeling on the floor, with my hands above my head, and all of a sudden, I hear the keys, and I hear that jump in the thing. This is it, my turn. The turnkey gives me the signal to wrap it up. I wrap up all my stuff, which is unusual because Larry was taken out without any of his gear with him. But I had to carry my blanket, cup, clothes, and anything, the anti-hat device and our fan. And then taken out, instead of going toward the torture cells, I was going to the back side of the pigsty, in the other side and away from where all the torture was. They opened the door, and I was put in the room. There were 3 guys in there that I'd never seen before, didn't know about. What's happening? Why I was left alone? I'm not on my knees, no harassment. What the heck is going on? With my history, those guys in the room are probably very nervous. They are Dave Everson, Jim Heitschuh, and Tom Sterling, all captured over 18 months after I was shot down. All 3 per noble had been tortured, but had no problems of note since. And I'm in there. One of them looks particularly bad, emaciated, really in bad shape, and to them, I'm probably not a good sign, because I'm a guy that could be bringing them all back to things. After the Eat Me meal came, I tried to give that guy that the meal shaped some of my rations, saying, "You really need this." He pushed it back to me, saying I needed more than he did. I said, "What the heck? No. I looked at the others, but got confirmation for the other guys in that room. I was worse than the worst guy that I thought was really bad off. And actually, this was the start of what the DOD history terms the good guy era, the Northern Prisons, 1970. We had cautious optimism on that. We're now with 3 men to pick up on things I didn't heard of, and so on. 4 men in a cell with 3 platform beds. I got one of the platforms, and one of the guys lay on the floor. we were there, and then in September of '69, we heard to get dressed with our long sleeve uniform. We heard about Ho Chi Minh's death, that he had died. Initially, I thought the big problems ahead. Indeed, the papers in the States, I found out later, thought the same thing, that North Vietnam would hold the war policies. But the communications through our top code indicated that all teacher and maltreatment basically had stopped. Got my first package ever. Daily routine became dull. I had an opportunity to enjoy the comforts of home, as it was, with my mat, my blankets, my cup, and all like that, and my sanitary device that was available to me. And daily routine actually became dull. In late '69, some people moved out and were given demolition tools and knocked down a wall. And that cell that we were in with 3 guys is doubled in size, and now we have 6 men in a double-sized cell, and we're able to do things as having discussions, play bridge, play chess, and all sorts of things. Started working on recovery, doing all sorts of PT moves, trying to build up. And in late '69, many people left the zoo. We knew that it's getting smaller there. We were moved back over to the barn in 3 cells, 11 guys, but during the day the doors were all left open. And so we got together, and in early December of '69, we eventually found out there was a raid at Santé where special forces tried to come and release us. Guards had placed some placements at the corners of our buildings, trying to ensure against possible attacks. They were scared. We were anticipatory, trying to open. Then Christmas came. They gave us a Bible. Went through a Bible service using St. Luke's as a foundation for a Christmas story. Had family packages, but the very next day, every turmoil again, and they did a strip search of us, lost most of the package items, hit a few like that, and then blindfolded and moved back into central Hanoi, Hoa Lo. Vietnamese were bringing all the people back into the middle of their city so that they couldn't, another Santé raid happen like that. We moved into a very large room, 9 men in the cell block number 6. That room, I mean, we rattled around there like a couple of peas in the doggone 10-gallon pot. And a few hours later, 10 more guys walked in the door, so now we're at 19. The next day, 20 more men moved in. Now we're 30 men in the building. Now we're fairly well filling that thing up. Not Hogan's Heroes, but so much better than it had been. And we found out that the same thing was happening around the camp, and that we had people now, about 350 of us, in one concentrated area. We were able then to organize, report to leaders, find out who was the senior man in the whole camp. It happened to be my squadron commander, Robbie Reisner, happened to be the guy. We had we had educational classes going on, all sorts of entertainment, escape committees, everything you could think of. One night after a guy had described how you can self-hypnotize, and one thing you could do was hypnotize to where your arms and legs were weightless. And one time I got up and out of my net to go to hit the bucket to relieve myself, and walking past all these guys under the nets, I could see a whole bunch of guys with arms and legs hanging in the air. They'd gone through this self-hypnotism business on it. But things would not be that well, all well. In one of our neighboring things, we had tried to establish church service, but in one of the neighboring rooms, during the church services, the Vietnamese had warned, don't lecture. Well, giving a sermon to them was a lecture. And as a result, they took the guy who was leading the sermon, which happened to be Reisner again, and they took him out of the camp, and with that, there was a start of a riot where the guys in that room started singing the national anthem. And of course, as soon as that started, all the other buildings in that area started singing the national anthem as well. And then all of a sudden, with the Reisner removed, they started the We Are room number 7, which where Reisner was, and those of us in 6 picked it up from that, and it went right around the camp also. So it so happened that in that room number 7, they had people who were lieutenant colonels and commanders. In other words, an 05 rank like that, whereas we majors and captains were in the other ones. But they took all of the guys that were in that higher rank out of that thing, and we kept trying to see what are we going to do. We in room number 6 followed with a request for more from the Vietnamese than we could, and the Vietnamese started a junior officer and charge program, but that didn't work, because as soon as the junior officer who was in charge would be told something, he would immediately turn around and go to the senior man in the room, tell him what was going on, and then he turned back to the Vietnamese. So it didn't make any difference at all. And we decided that if somebody was pulled out of our room like Reisner had and the senior men in that room, building 7 had, that we would, as a room, recite the Lord's Prayer in response to any relocation. Well, that happened, of course. And the response occurred, and it went through a series of things. All of a sudden, I'm the guy that's left. I'm the senior ranking officer, and I was able to establish what we termed a stair program. No vocal thing, but just all the tallest, biggest guys that we had in the room, the big guys who were over 6 foot tall, would just stare at guards and look mean at them. And really did a number on those poor young kids who were doing the guarding of that thing. But it worked. It got me an interview with the camp commander where I was able to lay out our problems, and they retaliated by sending me to another room, that room number 5, and I was there for a few months when all of a sudden they took a whole bunch of us and moved it to another camps. This one way up near the China border, a place we called Dog Patch, which was designed in a way to inhibit communication. In other words, the buildings were either on different levels, high, low, or in different orientations so that you couldn't see. Tried to stop communication. It didn't. We were able to communicate anyhow. We stayed there for a while with a rigid and very sparse environment to begin with, but slowly improving. We heard of a grave illness. A guy by the name of Warrant Officer John Prescott was taken to another building, and he eventually died. We think of some kind of disease, not sure what it was. But early in February of '73, there had been, back in the Camp Unity at the Hanoi Hilton, they formed a wing there, And those of us up there at the dog patch up by the China border, we all of a sudden heard trucks coming into the camp, and what we figured would happen was happening. They were taking everybody out of the camp and bringing them back down to the central Hanoi camp again. The talks in Paris were progressing to a point they wanted us all together again. We got together and we formed a wing, the 4th Allied POW wing, with our intention to return from captivity with honor, the 4th being the First World War, Second World War, Korea, and now in Vietnam, in which we had hostilities with allies fighting with us in all of those wars. And so that's how we named ourselves. Each of the rooms in that camp became a squadron of that wing. Eventually, on that 2nd of February, we were called out by the Vietnamese and lined up by squadrons, and they read to us the Paris Peace Accords, officially titled the Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam. We were very quiet in the ranks. After the announcement, Reisner, the Unity senior ranking officer, called us to attention and instructed the squadron SROs to dismiss us. There was no yelling, screaming, or anything like that. We just waited the days out, renewed friendships, like with my squadron mates, on that, put faces to names, make all sorts of lists. And then on the 10th of February, we received a copy of the notification of the Paris Accords, received clothing and shoes, etc. On the 12th of February, we got into buses. And in a group there from that bus, I was standing in line between guys that, by order of my shoot-down. Everybody in front of me had been shot down before and everybody behind me had been shot down after. Except the earlier buses of that took all the sick and injured first and got them out of there, and then the very earliest when it was out. We left Hanoi, arrived at Clark from the C-141s, and there's pictures of me in the airplanes, and then we had the long flight home. Started after a few days. I got to talk to my family on the phone from the Philippines, but on the 15th of February I started home, left Clark, through Hawaii, through Travis, California, St. Louis, and then on into Dayton, Ohio. I walked out the airplane then, greeted by my wife, mother, and 4 grown sons at this point. And there's a number of people that I knew or knew of very closely, but that are people that meant a lot to me that never were able to come home. I remember them. But I got an opportunity later on to fly again, and so I went down to Randolph Air Base just out of San Antonio, Texas, and got to fly a number of flights with some very nice young men on that in the T-33, with me in the front on the controls, doing what I loved so much. And we're ended up with a organization now that we have somebody that keeps us in touch on the internet all the time. We've got a website that keeps us in touch and allows us to establish reunions like that. And it's a wonderful life. And as I said when I got off the airplane in Travis, that I had to thank the American people who had who reached over time and space, took us by the hand and brought us home. And I thank them all for that.
Ray, thank you for all of that information. I am amazed how well organized you were and how much information you have, and your PowerPoint presentation is very illuminating. You got to the point of getting on that C-141 to come home. Could you kind of describe, if you can, and I know it must have been a tremendous experience, how you felt when you finally got off the ground in that airplane, and then what happened to you subsequent to that, the rest of your Air Force career?
Interesting, because I was at Clark for about three days going through the physicals like that. I went to, in the religion I'm a Catholic, I went to an individual mass with a priest, and the Catholic services had changed so much during the time I was gone that I didn't know what was going on. It took me a couple of services to figure out what the heck they were doing. But anyway, I happened to be the senior man on the airplane leaving there. I had that opportunity to go to the local exchange there and arrange to buy some stereo equipment and various things, presents to bring home to the family and like that. On the airplane, and I found out on the airplane I'm the senior man, and we fly originally into Hawaii, and when we get there, they want the senior man to get off the airplane and say something, and I decided that since that stop in Hawaii was essentially a Navy base, I think, I took the next senior man, to a Navy guy, and I said, "You give the things for that one," which he did, which is fine. And then we continued on the flight going to California, Travis Air Force Base. I got off the airplane there, and then made my thanks to the American people for bringing us home. And there happened to be the wife of one of my squadron mates, the guy that I kicked off the schedule, and I got shot down in the spot that he would have been flying, and on all probability he would have been shot down if I hadn't taken that spot. His wife was there, and I got the opportunity to have a few minutes of talking with her there. Then we got on the airplane into St. Louis at the airplace there in southern Illinois, and then back on a smaller airplane now and going into Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and that's when I got to visit my family. The feelings during that whole period of time was there was so much going on that I didn't have time to spend any place, because anything passing by was something new, something I had to all of a sudden stop paying attention here and look over to there, because something new was happening and I didn't want to miss it, like that. Got there, and my wife was there, and there were some of the POWs, I'm sorry to say, when they came home, their wives weren't there for them to see. My wife, my children, my mother, they were all there. They were ready for me, and it was good. I walked in the hospital, and the hallways in the hospital were just totally covered with sketches, drawings, letters, everything from people from all over, directed to us. I think it was just incredible. Then into a meeting with my personal physician, who stayed with me through the entire time I was there, my personal dentist, all like that. And, of course, the inevitable debrief and the intelligence people. And when I put on a session with him, probably longer than I'm spending with you in this program right now, of some of the information that I had loaded up in my head and needed to get out on it. And then having the opportunity to go home, as it was. My wife had left Okinawa, went back to her hometown, which was Kokomo, Indiana, and she had been there for a while and actually bought a house in that area, but had the opportunity to move on to the base where I had been stationed before, which is about 12 miles north of Kokomo, which she did, and sold that house that she had gotten. And that's where we came. We went to that base, and there was the house, and a lot of the things that I had left were there, and some things that I had never seen before, and sons, and all sorts of stuff, and opportunity to get together, and then all sorts of gifts that were given. We were given the opportunity to accept for 1 year a brand new vehicle from the Ford Motor Company, and we would use that vehicle for a year, and then we had the opportunity to buy it at a used car price after that, which was significantly below what the used car price should have been for that vehicle. And since I had the 4 kids, I opted for what to me was a station wagon, and got that. Got on the highway, went back to the East Coast for my nephew's graduation from the Naval Academy. My brother-in-law happened to be the station commander at Patuxent River Naval Air Station at the time, and we went in his captain's barge, or whatever you call it, gig, admiral's gig or something like that, up the river from Patuxent River Naval Air Station up to the Naval Academy, and watched the graduation, and back then again to his house there, which he had a primary, beautiful home right on the water like that, and saw the marriage then of that nephew to the wife that he still has to this day, which is very nice to me. That both my brother-in-law and my nephew both retired from the Navy as 3-star admirals, were vice admirals, so that's pretty good of them. So then for the following that, as things getting together, they gave us the opportunity to, and encouraged us to go through a debriefing that the Air Force gave to us about what was happening in current day Air Force. Mm-hmm. And that was held down in Alabama at Maxwell Air Force Base, the site of a lot of the Air Force's education schools, the Command and Staff College, the Air War College, and a whole bunch of other things. And that we had people from the Pentagon that came down to give these briefings. And at the same time, I was given the assignment, a follow-on assignment, to go to the Air War College. And so while I was there, I arranged for housing for the family, went back up to Indiana and packed up and back to Alabama for about 11 months of time there. Then finished the Air War College program, and that's when I got the chance to go to Texas to go and get flying time in the T-38. So went to Randolph Air Force Base and got my time there, and at that time had the option of going for an enhanced physical, and went through the same physical that astronauts were going through then at Brooks Army Air Force Base that go through that program, at which time I found out things about me that I'd never known before. And at the same time, my wife was given the opportunity to get a physical as well. And that was a bad part of it, because during that physical, the X-ray physician put on her records that he noted an area of increased density in the lower portion of right lung. Recommend repeat X-ray. Nobody picked up that information. 2 years later, she died from lung cancer. And I got an apology letter from the Surgeon General of the Air Force for their failure on being able to pick that up. I imagine if I had been asking for a view at my records and her records, I would have seen it. But that's something you just didn't do at that time. But anyway, during the period of time in the War College, we had a number of speakers come through. And I had the opportunity then to, at times, speak with some of those speakers, which sometimes were either political people of political note, or more probably Air Force senior officers, and speculate with them on what might be a good future for me, since I had been a relatively young major when I was shot down, and all of a sudden I had gone through lieutenant colonel, and now I was a full colonel, coming through War College, and what's best for me. One of them happened to be a two-star general who was at the time the program manager for the F-15 program office, which was just getting really started. And he suggested to me that I'm being reassigned from my position there at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to take over the Electronic System Division in Hanscom Field in Massachusetts. And I could use you there. So I said, yes, sir. And so we moved to Hanscom Field, just outside the Beltway around Boston, between Lexington, Concord, Massachusetts, and Bedford, Massachusetts, 3 towns. It's sort of situated between the 3 of them. And I was there until, and I was assigned there in advanced plans. I took over a program they called SeekBus, which is a jam-resistant communication system that was going to be the only way that the new AWACS program would be able to communicate to the ground, because standard communications could be jammed, and they would not be, so they would see all, but they would not be able to tell a thing. But with my program, they could tell all. They could tell the people what they saw, what was going on. I took that program through the early stages to the point where it came with a program, an honest-to-God program called JTIDS, Joint Tactical Information Distribution System, and got it started on the way as a joint program with the Navy. And we're having people assigned to me from the several services, and at that time I was on a information tour, telling people in Europe about this program and how it worked with the AWACS and what potential it had in just overall communications, that possibilities of helping in tactical warfare. In Europe, when I got a notice to please return home, says your wife is in the hospital. I came home and got to the hospital in Boston, and they told me that our preferred diagnosis is pneumonia. And of course it turned out to be cancer. She lasted about 40 days. And then since I was so newly released and all like that, what happened then went very smoothly. A memorial service for her, and no hesitation whatsoever, right from that thing right down to Arlington for a position at the cemetery there. I didn't have to wait during the period of time like that. With my second wife going to the Arlington also, that took about 7 months before I was able to get a date to get her interred there on it. So, but I was still there at Fossenkemper Field, and at the time, General Creech, Wilbur Creech, was the commander of Electronic Systems Division, an outstanding officer and a tremendous intellect. He had me transferred from my position in an active program like that, and moved me as a deputy commander over a series of programs on that. Keep me busy enough at that until a point came where they were going to send me to Washington, D.C., to Andrews Air Force Base and Research and Development headquarters. And I said, no, I don't think so. I had seen enough of the Washington scene while I was going back and forth from Boston down there to brief on my programs. I didn't need that kind of stuff that was going on down there at the time. So that's when I put my time in to retire. And my new wife at the time, we put a map on the wall and said, where don't we want to live? Everything north of the Mason District, the Dixon line fell out immediately, so we started looking in the south. We visited down to the Tampa-St. Pete area, and her ankles blew up like balloons as soon as she got off the airplane. We went to the Austin, Texas area. There was a lot of defense industry there. I thought I might be able to get some kind of job like that. Same thing. We didn't want Southern California for some reason. And we had a guy that I had known in one of my early squadrons like that, who was living in Phoenix at the time, actually in Tempe at the time. We went out to visit him, got off the airplane in July, and the highest temperature yet, and yet her ankles were fine. No problem at all. Says, okay, I guess we found a place. So we moved. And I've been here ever since.
Okay. Ron, I want to thank you for talking to us today and telling us your story. It's incredible. I have a very small token of appreciation for you, which is a commemorative Air Force coin. I wish I could give you more, but that's about the best I can do.
Okay,
Thanks
you.
again.
I guess the coin is inside this plastic box.
It just
okay.
unscrews.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.